podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corwin. It's June 1, 2017, and today we're speaking with Dr. Melissa Crouch, Senior Lecturer at the University of New South Wales. Much of Melissa's research is in the field of Asian legal studies, with a focus on constitutional change, law and development, and law and religion in Southeast Asia. One of Melissa's many publications is the edited volume Islam and the State in Myanmar, Muslim-Buddhist Relations and the Politics of Belonging, published in 2016. Melissa contributed chapters to, as well as edited, this seminal work, and this is what we will speak about today. Hello, Melissa.
Hi.
Okay, so according to the 2014 census data, Muslims make up somewhere between 2.3 and 4.3% of the population in Myanmar today. You claim that current events in the country have reflected a profound lack of understanding about these Muslims and Islam in Myanmar more generally. So how did you come to write this book, which attempts to rectify this lack, and why in particular did you choose to frame it in conjunction with the state?
That's a good question. So the idea for this book, or the opportunity really, came about in Singapore. So I was doing a postdoc there, and I had the opportunity to run an academic conference, and the theme was Islam and the State, and the idea was really to try and bring together people who were doing empirical, sometimes ethnographic or historical field research on Muslims in Myanmar. And in part, that was a recognition that, there have been a lot of human rights reports, a lot of advocacy reports, but very little contemporary research, academic research on Islam and Muslims in Myanmar. And I think that is an important contribution that can be made from academics. So that was a reason. While it was an academic conference, we had the rather unusual experience of having a large number of Myanmar Muslims from Singapore come along to the conference, and that really provided quite an important dynamic to the conference, I think, because it was our discussions were very much informed by a lot of their views. In relation to the census and the numbers which you mentioned, so this book, I should say, was written, most of the chapters were written before the census, but then and then it was published. I think there's been a lot of focus on the numbers, but in some sense, I think, the issues are much bigger than that, obviously, in part because we know historically there were probably much larger numbers of Muslims in Myanmar, and then in the sort of 40s, 60s, 70s, there were a mass exodus back, many to India. And so, the Muslim population in Myanmar today is probably perhaps less than it was percentage-wise. And I think historically there has been a number of prominent Muslim leaders as well who've had a significant influence on the state, on politics in Myanmar, on a range of important social and political areas. So again, for that reason, I think that it is important to recognise that contribution. And I think in particular, and one reason I note in the introductory chapter is because even though there have been, for example, prominent Muslims in politics in the past, that's at times been overlooked by historians and those studying Myanmar.
The fact that they were Muslim is just overlooked, or do you mean that their contributions as a whole have been overlooked?
No, I mean, for example, that there have been sort of histories written of Myanmar that are histories of the Burma in Myanmar, and in many ways overlook, I guess. For example, we know that there are Muslim communities that existed prior to colonization in Myanmar and have a long history that they can trace back in Myanmar. Of course, there were many that came during colonization and afterwards as well, but I think at times there hasn't been the scholarship to really recognize that legacy. And particularly Stephen Keck's chapter in the book, I think, makes that point quite well. He sort of contrasts it with the example of America, and he says, well, if we cut out the African American or Jewish community from the history of the US, if we just completely sort of ignored the fact that they were an important part of the US, we probably wouldn't be considered as a very accurate or trustworthy historian in that sense. And so I think bringing them back into the story of Myanmar and the history of the state is important.
Okay, so with your background, I suppose it makes sense with your academic background. But why did you choose to frame a book about Muslims and Islam in Myanmar in regards to interactions with the state? Islam and the State is the title of the book.
Look, I think that was because at times perhaps the conversation in a more general, popular media sense is about the fact that Muslims are excluded from the state. And of course, in part, that is the case, and there are a couple of chapters that do deal with that. But I was also interested in really trying to hone in on and illustrate ways in which, Muslims are very much part of the fabric of the state and have daily interactions and are both influencer and are influenced by it. And I think in addition, because, we're in a stage where since the transition from military rule, that the state is becoming more important. The administration is becoming more important, whether we like that or not. And so I think for that reason, there's a need to really understand what is the interaction between and how do Muslims understand themselves in relation to the state.
Let's delve deeper into the details of your own chapters in the book, in which you develop a concept of a Muslim mosaic in Myanmar, 3 M's, positioned as an Islamic crossroads between Central, South and Southeast Asia. So what is this evocative mosaic, and how can we better understand it in Myanmar and transnationally?
So I guess, my background in studying Islam in Indonesia, I guess I was struck, as I came to understand more about the Myanmar context, about the sheer diversity within the Muslim community here. And that there really are many different parts of the Muslim world represented here. In Stephen Keck's chapter, again, he points to both the connections with China and India and the influence that has had. There's also sort of Malay influence as well. And that's in some sense represented in the different communities that you have within the Muslim community in Myanmar.
Persia too, right?
Yeah, that's right. The former Mughal Empire, a lot of there was a lot of movement from there down into Myanmar, and many people could trace their ancestry back to there. And so, for that reason, there are, linguistic differences among Muslim communities in Myanmar, ethnic differences, cultural differences, and so I think it's quite difficult sometimes to talk about, the Muslim community because, of course, there's a lot of diversity within it, and including the way in which sort of Muslims perceive themselves in relation to the state. So in one of my chapters, I try to kind of map out, I guess, the different positions that Muslims might find themselves in relation to state. For some, have citizenship, maybe more connected or engaged in certain ways, and perhaps may kind of adopt the Burma Muslim identity in the sense that they're both Burmese and they're Muslim. They may still have, ethnicity of a mixed background, but they identify as Burma Muslim, and that's the way they kind of have tried to create an identity for themselves. There are others, I guess, who identify more with their ethnic background, whether it's Indian Muslims or Rohingya, and I guess they often have a slightly different relationship, perhaps, to the state. And this, I should say, there were big debates about this during the independence period, and there were even questions about whether the Muslim community should be a recognised ethnic group, whether the Burma Muslim should be one of the recognised categories in terms of citizenship. And in the end, the sort of Burma Muslim community decided that no, we should just accept that we're Burmese. We're not going to kind of lobby for a separate identity. And I mean, that's had consequences going forward, but that was the position at the time. But it was still very much a debate, and there were certainly those who didn't agree with that and were trying to find other ways to be recognised.
So, given that there is this diversity, this Muslim mosaic, and your work and others is trying to highlight the I guess, the importance of recognising this diversity and going into detail more in this category, are there any issues or is there any relationship with the state in which all of Islam, all Muslims in Myanmar are unified? Are there any claims we can make about this entire sort of category?
On the issue of unity, actually, I would say that particularly since 2012 and then 2014 violence, that there was certainly a much greater urgency among Muslim leaders from diverse groups to come together and in a way that hadn't happened before, in the sense that because the violence affected a range of different Muslim communities, so not just those in northern Rakhine State, the Rohingya, but, in Shan State and other places. Yeah. Geographically, it affected a wide range of groups. There was a sense that, it could affect any Muslim. And so sort of for that reason, there were attempts to try and build greater unity within the Muslim community. The real challenge, though, is that as far as I'm aware, they were never able to hold... So what they were hoping to do is hold a kind of all-Myanmar sort of Muslim conference for Muslim leaders to try and just discuss some of these issues that they're facing, discuss ways, to address them and so on. And this idea of having sort of an all-Myanmar Muslim conference goes back to the sort of 30s and 40s when there was 2, maybe 3 main Muslim groups, and they would have these sort of nationwide meetings on things like education, should they use Arabic or Urdu or Burmese in their Islamic education institutions, discussing questions like that. But unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, sort of in the present time, they haven't been able to get permission to hold these meetings, or if they did, the situation was still such that security-wise, they were very concerned about the fact that if they hold a nationwide meeting, all Muslim leaders in one place, and people hear of this, that could create a security, that could be a security threat for them. So I guess that's been a particular challenge for them in, while on the one hand, the issues that they face, affecting a wide range of people within the Muslim community, and there are efforts to try and build greater unity so that they can try to have their voice heard by the government, but at the same time the practical challenges of doing that are quite significant.
Let's move to this idea of lived experiences, and this is like a common theme in the book. There's an entire section devoted to this, categorizing the chapters. So lived experiences and the politics of belonging. Such experiences offer insights into the quotidian reality of negotiation that Muslims in Myanmar are faced with the state. These chapters capstone your own history of the use of Muslim personal law in Myanmar. What is personal law, and how does it provide a unique window into the interaction between the state and Muslim communities?
So by personal law, I simply mean family law. So, the law that applies if you want to get a divorce, adopt a child, if your father dies and you need to arrange the inheritance. So this chapter, focuses on Islamic personal law. And I guess one tries to highlight the fact that it exists in Myanmar. I guess many popular debates, sometimes those on the kind of pro-nationalist Buddhist side often say things about, we're worried that there's going to be Islamic law in Myanmar. Well, there already is Islamic law in Myanmar. I mean, just for personal law, of course, not for other matters. So one, it's already there. So Islamic personal law has a strong legacy to the British colonial era. So in British India, they established this idea of Anglo-Mohammedan law, which is essentially just the law that was to apply to Muslims in relation to family law matters. And so when the British colonised Myanmar and they were sort of going about things in the same way, okay, what are we going to do with family law? We've got Burmese Buddhist law over here. We need something for the Muslims. We're just going to cut and paste what we have in British India. And Burma was part of British India at the time. And that will apply to Muslims if they come to court in relation to these matters. I think the interesting thing then is that, it's continued on. And so I refer to the work of Barry Hooker, Professor Barry Hooker, who wrote...
You were very respectful of him while at the same time pointing out the quite glaring shortcomings.
Yeah, so, look, Professor Barry Hooker's work is, in one sense, he's, the main figure on sort of legal history in Southeast Asia, and in particular Islamic law in Southeast Asia. I mean, he's written very extensively, particularly on Malaysia, Indonesia, but then also more broadly. I think his chapter provides an initial foundation, but yes, as you say, he didn't look at anything post-1960s, and so I'm clearly saying it continued on in the socialist and military era, was reinforced by the courts as well as, by lawyers and Islamic leaders, and that today, that's the way in which people just decide these kinds of disputes. And I think it has... it's one example of the way in which Muslims, interact with the state, that if you are a citizen of Myanmar and you have disputes relating to Islamic personal law, you can go to the courts and have your decision decided in that way. But then I try to put it sort of in context comparatively by saying that actually Myanmar in some sense is quite unusual because these Islamic personal law cases are heard by the general courts. So that is by judges who are usually not Muslim and who have no background in Islamic law. And if you look at sort of the rest of the region, I guess there are some countries that have specific courts for Islamic personal law, so judges who are trained, specifically in this area. But Myanmar, is an example. It's quite an unusual example in that sense, where it's simply dealt with within the existing legal system. So maybe if I come back to your point on lived experiences and the politics of belonging. 2015, we know that there was a lot of controversy around the issue of the race and religion laws. Those who were advocating for these laws, were fairly clear that they were supposed to be targeting Muslims. And yet, I think what was interesting about this debate is that there was no discussion of what currently exists. And so, for example, only a few years ago, the Supreme Court had recognised that the Buddhist women's special marriage law of 1957 still exists, that's what the courts are supposed to apply, and yet the 2015 laws were essentially proposing quite a similar version of that, and there was very little discussion about the existing legal system and how that currently operates and whether it needs to be changed or not. I think the other interesting thing, and the reason why the subtitle of the book is sort of Muslim-Buddhist relations, is recognising that we do need to think and study carefully about the position of Muslims within a Buddhist state and that interaction, the position of Muslims as minorities within a Buddhist majority state. And again, I think the 2015 race and religion laws are an interesting example because for the monogamy law, for example, I think people assumed that it was targeting Muslims in terms of the assumption that it must be Muslims, not Buddhists, that are polygamous, and so therefore a law of monogamy will most affect Muslims, although, let's face it, most people weren't. There was not a lot of criticism or debate over that law. What I think is interesting, again, that Professor Barry Hooker has written about in other work is that in Myanmar there is a system of Myanmar Buddhist law, Myanmar customary law for Buddhists, and polygamy is allowed for Buddhists in Myanmar. So the monogamy law actually also affects Buddhists and actually has quite a profound effect in the sense that under Burmese Buddhist law, a second wife, for example, has clear rights to inheritance, her children have clear rights to inheritance, and so on. So it provides, a framework. But now you have a monogamy law, and presumably the second wives simply don't exist, or at least if they do still exist, they don't have rights to inheritance, and so on. So the debate around the 2015 race and religion laws were quite unusual in when you looked at it further about how much people did or didn't know about what currently existed within the legal system and what the social reality is, I think, in Myanmar.
I didn't really follow much of that. I remember one piece that was arguing that actually these laws could be good for women who are trying to get divorces from their husbands,
yes,
something like that.
Yes.
I was like, oh, that's a fresh take.
Oh no, so I've written a piece, and essentially there's what I call a revenge clause in the law, which is that for women, so one, it makes it easier for them to get a divorce. But two, if they're granted a divorce and the husband because the husband is in the wrong, he's had an affair or something, he's at fault, then they also get all the property. The woman gets all the marital property.
Wow.
So I call that the revenge clause.
Yeah, that's
I mean, I think the big gap though is whether how the court's then dealing with these 2015 race and religion laws, because so I guess one of my interests in this chapter is in relation to Islamic personal law. Actually, in the past, all the family law was essentially, created by judges and perpetuated by judges. But 2015, you kind of have the legislature coming in and saying, no, we're going to define, what is a marriage, who can marry who, and so on. And then supposedly that's supposed to be applied by the courts. But, whether the courts are responsive to the legislature intervening in that way, I think is something that we'll only know over time. Obviously, we do know there have been women who've made complaints to the police about their husbands under these laws, but we also know that it's often Buddhist couples, not a Buddhist and a Muslim. So Ma'abarta have clearly come out and said we were wrong. The phrase they use is we wanted to catch the rabbit, but instead we caught the cat, meaning that we wanted to use these laws to target Muslims, but actually we realise now that it's Buddhist women taking revenge on their Buddhist husbands who've got second wives they didn't know about or who are having an affair, that sort of thing. So the unintended consequences of legal reform.
So thinking about Muslim-Buddhist relations, I've got these two kind of emblematic things that leap out at me. One is from the research in your book, which is people mentioning again and again that Mindon Min built this mosque, and it's this sort of this sign of accommodation and welcoming and coexistence, Buddhists between Muslims. But then also in my day-to-day life, I'm regularly witness to off-the-cuff kind of bigotry against Muslims. Some of the narratives are similar to my own country, Australia, which is that people feel threatened by Muslims and they feel like Muslims in Myanmar are imposing their ideology on others. But this bigotry also extends to very simple things like cleanliness. People say to me often, oh, that area is dirty because there's lots of Muslims there. The stairwell is dirty because there's Muslims there, which is obviously completely ridiculous and different to what I'm used to in Australia, my home country. And these kinds of opinions are often vented by otherwise quite thoughtful, cosmopolitan people. So I wonder how can we overcome this kind of ingrained prejudice? Is it possible?
Yes, that's a big question. So one, clearly, discrimination and bigotry, as you say, can happen anywhere to a range of people, but that there is often noticeably discrimination and views that don't seem to be based on facts when it comes to Muslims in Myanmar. And I do think, in particular, it has taken on, quite severe and tragic consequences for many Muslims in Myanmar, both, those who are living in northern Rakhine State, the Rohingya, as well as this year in 2017 with the assassination of U Ko Ni, who was a prominent constitutional lawyer and also a prominent Muslim figure. And so, yes, there's the day-to-day stuff, as you say, but there's also obviously a much bigger picture here, or at least for some Muslims, the consequences are far more serious. I think, linking it back to the book, I guess what I was particularly interested in was trying to bring some academic depth to the issue, really. And while still recognising that there's clearly a role for human rights reports, there's clearly a need for advocacy reports, but that, that the academics can bring a different perspective and voice to these issues and to the debate. And so that's, I guess, the small contribution that the book tries to make, and I guess the hope is that others will be able to build on this to try and build up a greater picture of contemporary Muslims in Myanmar, and in some ways try to begin to break down some of those stereotypes that seem to persist about the Muslim community in Myanmar. I think it's also important to keep in mind that, Myanmar has only recently begun to make a transition from military rule, and, the period of socialist military rule, was a period when you couldn't necessarily get accurate news, when there was a lot of stereotyping of certain groups, a lot of outright discrimination of certain groups, and I think Muslims were one group that in particular were targeted during that time. And I think it's difficult if people have lived their whole lives under that kind of stereotyping. It will take a while to break free from that.
Okay, what's the future for scholarship on Islam in Myanmar? Do you have any concrete plans, or is there anything that you would like to see apart from what you've already outlined?
Oh, look, I've got plenty of plans, but I need some time to do some writing. I'm certainly interested in continuing to work on some of the themes that really are just beginning in this book. Related to the chapter on Islamic personal law, I'm interested in fatwa, so fatwa being an Islamic legal decision, and I guess the choice between formal and informal institutions for dispute resolution. So, for example, in that chapter I look at, formal dispute resolution, so going to the courts to resolve your marital disputes, whatever it might be. But the question of, how do people choose between different forums? So, as a Muslim, you might be able to go to your Islamic leader at the mosque down the road to get a fatwa, an Islamic legal opinion about whether you can divorce your husband or not. Or you could go to the courts and essentially ask for a same position. Or you could go to the Muslim leader first and then take the fatwa to the courts and kind of use that as evidence if it's in your favour. Or if you don't like that Muslim leader, maybe you could go to that Muslim leader over there and get a different fatwa if it's in your opinion. So that's sort of, there's a concept in academic Islamic studies of forum shopping for fatwa when it comes to issues around dispute resolution. So I'm interested particularly, in that informal space and the role that religious leaders play, and the questions of religious authority as opposed to state authority, and when one is more important than the other. But I think that's going to be a long time in coming. I should say I have more recently looked at the Constitutional Tribunal, and where that links to this book is that there was a case in the Constitutional Tribunal in 2015. This was in relation to the issue of citizenship, and in particular in relation to the question of if there was to be a referendum. So if there was a proposal for constitutional amendment, a referendum was held, who can vote in that referendum? The issue was, does it have to be full citizens, or can those who have white cards vote? And unfortunately, the Constitutional Tribunal came to the decision that only those who have full citizenship, or at least those who don't have white cards, can vote in a constitutional referendum. So essentially you have the Constitutional Tribunal playing a part along with Parliament and other institutional actors in the disenfranchisement of white card holders for the 2015 elections. Yes, there is one more thing I want to add, which is that for this book and in some conferences that I've spoken at, one thing that I've really tried to emphasize is that I think to go forward in this particular area is that we do really need people who have an Islamic studies background, and particularly those who might have skills in Urdu or Arabic and other languages that are important among the Muslim community, to be part of the community of people studying Muslims in Myanmar, because I think it's only through that we'll be able to get greater depth in understanding of the politics of belonging, of Muslims' daily practices, of how they interact with the state. And so, I hope that, as you mentioned before, this idea of Myanmar being a crossroads sort of for the Islamic world, that it will need academics and PhD students who have a range of skills, linguistic skills and backgrounds, to be able to look further and to really advance the field, I think. So my hope is that, there are people from Islamic studies who can bring to bear some of their skills in understanding the Muslim community here.
Okay, now it's the tradition of our podcast to ask all of our guests if they would like to make a recommendation to listeners. It can be as heavy as a hefty academic treatise, or it can be as light as a recommendation on a place to drink beer. So, do you have anything for us?
Look, always happy to recommend books, but maybe let me recommend something on the lighter side of things. It's by a guy called Bilal M. Rashid, who's currently based in the US, but he's Burmese Muslim. And he is the son of Ul Rashid, who was a very well-known and prominent political figure in the 40s and 50s in Myanmar. So the book's called The Invisible Patriot, Reminiscences of Burma's Freedom Movement. And it's available on Amazon. It's quite cheap. But it's a fascinating, sometimes, rambling, but storytelling perspective on Bilal M. Rashid's childhood. And there's a lot in there that aspects of Myanmar's history, I think, that are not very well known. I think he was someone who's documented, kept a lot of original documents. So things like Ul Rashid was, imprisoned in 1962 when there was the coup, and a lot of political leaders and important figures were put under arrest. He was then released a few years later. He decided to stay on in Myanmar in the hopes that maybe the political situation was changed. But then was imprisoned again in 1972, which actually I didn't realise, and then was only let out again a year or two later, despite the fact that there wasn't really anything of substance, any reason for them to imprison him yet again. I think he was an example of someone who had held various ministerial positions, and so incredibly influential in politics in those early years, but who really had, I guess, a lot of his potential cut off by the 1962 coup, and yet still kind of maintained, even after the first period in prison, decided to stay in Burma, like the book sort of documents. Some of his children had already left. He was sort of, should I leave and go to Pakistan, or should I just stay here? No, I'll stay. Maybe it'll get better. Maybe I can still contribute. He gets put in prison again. So it's an interesting history of an important political figure who also was Muslim and had connections to some of the major sort of Muslim organisations of the time as well. So highly recommend it.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Melissa. Thank you very much for making the time. And I hope that your research/study trip here in Myanmar is productive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Until next time.